Close your eyes for a moment, or keep them open. Either way, I want you to think about the last time you actually watched a Family Guy episode and felt like you genuinely understood what you were looking at. Not just the jokes, not just the cutaway that made you laugh, or groan, or stare blankly at your ceiling wondering why you were still awake at 2 in the morning. I mean the deeper shape of the thing, the architecture underneath all the chaos. Because here is something that most people who have watched this show for 25 years still have not quite put together. And it is this. Family Guy was never what it looked like on the surface. Settle in, get comfortable. Maybe you are in bed right now, or on a couch somewhere. Or maybe you have headphones in and the world outside has gone quiet and dark and this voice is the only thing filling the room. That is exactly where I want you. Because what we are going to do tonight is slow everything down. We are going to walk through this show, one layer at a time, like peeling something back very carefully so you can see what lives underneath without disturbing it too much. And what you find when you do that, when you actually look at Family Guy with patience and curiosity instead of just watching it as background noise while you eat dinner, is something genuinely surprising. Something that changes the way the whole thing feels. Seth MacFarlane created this show in 1999. He was 25 years old. He had just finished studying animation at the Rhode Island School of Design, and before he ever pitched Family Guy to Fox, he had made 2 short animated films called The Life of Larry and Larry and Steve. If you watch those shorts, something clicks into place almost immediately. The middle-aged, slightly dim man named Larry and his intellectual dog named Steve, these were the earliest drafts of Peter and Brian Griffin. The whole DNA of the show was already there, encoded in those little films like a blueprint. MacFarlane took those characters, expanded them, built a house around them, gave them a family, gave them a neighborhood, gave them a town called Quahog, Rhode Island, and then wrapped all of it in the most aggressively irreverent comedy he could manufacture. Fox gave him $50,000 to develop a pilot. He made the pitch, they liked what they saw, and on January 31st, 1999, right after Super Bowl 33, Family Guy aired for the first time. Around 22 million people watched that first episode. And from those first few minutes, the show was already doing something underneath the surface that most of those 22 million viewers were not consciously noticing. The show MacFarlane described to the BBC as a modern vaudeville, which is a theatrical tradition built on broad comedy, physical gags, and quick character sketches, was also at the same time a deeply personal act of social criticism. Every member of the Griffin family, every running joke, every stylistic choice the show made, carried something inside it, a meaning, a commentary, a piece of anxiety about what America was and what it was doing to the people who lived inside it. The reason most people miss this, the reason the conversation around Family Guy for the better part of 25 years has been almost entirely about whether the show is funny or offensive or going downhill, is because the hidden layer was hidden on purpose. It was camouflaged by absurdity, buried under fart jokes and Conway Twitty cutaways and chicken fights that went on for 4 minutes. The thing about really effective satire is that it does not announce itself. It sneaks in while you are laughing at something else. So tonight, we are going to look at what was actually hiding in there. We are going to go character by character, theme by theme, and piece by piece. And by the end, you will have a picture of Family Guy that is quite different from the one you had when you started listening. The show that seemed like noise was actually saying something. The question is just whether anyone was listening closely enough to hear it. The first episode was called Death Has a Shadow. That title alone is worth sitting with for a moment. Not The Griffin Family or Welcome to Quahog or some neutral, cheerful invitation into the world of the show. Death Has a Shadow. From the very first frame, from the very first title card, the show was naming something it intended to carry with it for its entire run, the awareness that danger and darkness live right alongside the ordinary, that they cast long shadows over the everyday without the everyday always noticing them. The episode itself involves Peter losing his job and collecting welfare fraudulently, which is a story about desperation and deceit, and the gap between what working-class Americans need and what the systems around them actually provide. All of that wrapped in a title about death. And the pattern held across those first 4 episodes. Death Has a Shadow. I Never Met the Dead Man. Chitty Chitty Death Bang. Mind Over Murder. MacFarlane was a fan of old suspenseful radio dramas from the 1930s and 1940s, and that influence found its way into the death-themed episode titles of the show's opening season. A private reference, visible only to people who knew what they were looking at. The show was hiding things from the very first episode, in the very first title, and it was going to keep hiding things for as long as it ran. The show knew what it was doing from day one. It was hiding it skillfully. And that is where this whole story begins. Before we go any further, drop a comment below and tell me where you are in the world right now and what time it is wherever you are listening from. I love knowing where these videos reach. And if you have not subscribed yet, this is the moment. It is completely free and it makes a real difference to what I can keep making. Okay, let us begin for real. Section 2, Who Seth MacFarlane Actually Was and Why That Changes Everything. To understand what Family Guy was hiding, you first need to understand the person who hid it. And Seth MacFarlane is a more complicated figure than the version of him that usually shows up in conversation, which tends to be either genius provocateur or the guy who ruined Sunday night cartoons, depending on who you ask. He was born on October 26, 1973, in Kent, Connecticut. He grew up in a small New England town, and his roots in that part of the country go back extraordinarily far. His family has been in New England since the 1600s, and he is a documented descendant of William Brewster, one of the passengers on the Mayflower. There is something quietly relevant about that. The man who would go on to create some of the most irreverent, anti-establishment comedy in American television history came from one of the oldest, most deeply rooted American lineages you can have. That tension between where you come from and what you actually believe, between inherited tradition and personal conviction, runs through almost everything MacFarlane ever made. He is, by birth and bloodline, the establishment. He spent his career making a show that never stopped questioning it. He studied animation at the Rhode Island School of Design, which is one of the most prestigious art schools in the United States, located in Providence, Rhode Island. While he was there, he based the accent and general vibe of Peter Griffin on security guards he used to hear talking around campus. He was not building a caricature from scratch, in other words. He was drawing from real observations about real working-class men in real New England environments. Peter Griffin, from his very first draft, was a character constructed from genuine anthropological attention to the actual texture of a specific kind of American life. The accent MacFarlane heard and captured was the sound of a particular world, a world of physical labor and neighborhood loyalty, and very specific cultural references and no particular interest in being understood by the kinds of people who went to art school. While he was at RISD, he worked on his thesis film, The Life of Larry. That film was later shown to executives at Hanna-Barbera by one of his professors, and on the strength of it, MacFarlane got hired to work on shows like Johnny Bravo, Cow and Chicken, and Dexter's Laboratory. He was in his early 20s, doing professional animation work, learning the architecture of the industry from the inside. This period matters enormously because it gave MacFarlane something that most young creative people never get: actual experience with the gap between a creative vision and what a commercial network is willing to air. He watched how the machine worked. He understood its pressures and its tolerances. By the time he pitched Family Guy to Fox, he was not a wide-eyed kid with a wild idea. He was a technically trained, industry-experienced animator who had been thinking very carefully about what kind of show he wanted to make, and who understood which parts of his vision he would be able to sneak through, and which parts would need to be disguised. What MacFarlane wanted to make was something that could be many things at once. He described his ambition for the show in terms of vaudeville, but he was also deeply influenced by classic radio programs from the 1930s and 1940s. He loved the old suspense shows, the dramas that played out entirely in sound, where the imagination did the visual work. He was also a devoted fan of musicals, of big band jazz, of the elaborate showmanship of mid-century entertainment. He could sing. He played piano. He was, beneath the crude exterior of his most famous creation, a genuinely sophisticated person with a wide and deeply cultivated set of artistic influences. When the show did musical numbers, and it did them often and well, this was not a gimmick. It was an authentic expression of something MacFarlane actually loved and was genuinely trained in. The sophistication kept surfacing underneath the vulgarity, like a well-read man who tells dirty jokes to seem approachable. He was, and is, an atheist. A vocal, committed, intellectually engaged atheist who had thought carefully about religion and arrived at a place of genuine non-belief, not the lazy nihilism of someone who just could not be bothered, but the considered skepticism of someone who had read and thought and concluded. He has cited figures like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens as intellectual influences. His engagement with the arguments around religion and secularism is serious rather than superficial. This matters enormously because it means that every time Family Guy made a joke about God or Jesus or organized religion, there was a genuine philosophical position underneath it. MacFarlane was not just being provocative for ratings. He was expressing something he actually believed. The provocation was real, but so was the conviction that generated it. He was also, by his own admission, closest to the character of Brian Griffin. Not Peter, not Stewie. The talking dog. He uses his completely unmodified natural speaking voice for Brian, the only character on the show for whom he does not perform any vocal modification at all. Brian's political views are MacFarlane's political views. Brian's atheism is MacFarlane's atheism. Brian's aspirations as a writer, his love of jazz, his fondness for martinis, his sense of himself as an intellectual surrounded by people who do not fully appreciate him, all of it comes directly from MacFarlane's own self-perception. In a 2004 interview with the Daily Princetonian, MacFarlane acknowledged similarities between himself and Brian directly. He was not just describing a character. He was describing himself, carefully, in public, with the character as a kind of shield. So from the very beginning, Family Guy contained a secret self-portrait. Hidden inside a show about a stupid man and his ridiculous family was a thinly veiled version of the man who created it, the one character who could see the absurdity clearly, who tried to say intelligent things, who kept failing to be taken as seriously as he wanted to be. That is not a coincidence. That is design. MacFarlane put himself into the show and then surrounded that self-portrait with chaos, and the chaos served as camouflage. If you wanted to find Seth MacFarlane in Family Guy, you had to look past Peter, past Stewie, past Lois, past all the noise and the spectacle, and find the dog, and then you had to understand that the dog was the creator's honest self-assessment, intelligent, aspirational, frustrated, and occupying a position in the household that was lower than he felt he deserved. He was also shaped, in ways he has acknowledged, by the specific terror of September 11th, 2001. He was booked on American Airlines Flight 11, the first plane to hit the World Trade Center. He missed the flight by approximately 10 minutes because he had a hangover and his travel agent had given him the wrong departure time. He later said that if it had been meant for him to be on that flight, he would have accepted it, but there is no question that the experience of being that close to catastrophe and walking away changed something in his understanding of time, of mortality, of what it means to still be here when you so easily might not have been. That awareness of life as something precarious and not guaranteed pulses quietly through his work in ways that are easy to miss but impossible to unsee once you start looking. The man who built Family Guy was not the buffoon who sometimes appeared in interviews making shock value statements. He was a New England-rooted, classically trained, philosophically committed artist who had stared directly at his own potential death and walked away, and then spent the next 25 years hiding all of that inside a cartoon about a fat man who fights a giant chicken. Understanding this man is the prerequisite for understanding his show. Because everything Family Guy was hiding, it was hiding inside the specific architecture of Seth MacFarlane's mind. His biases, his fears, his loves, his frustrations, his politics, his cosmology, all of it found its way in. Not always cleanly, not always with perfect execution, but consistently, reliably, in ways that reward patient attention over time. Section 3. The town that was never just a town. The fictional city of Quahog, Rhode Island, is modeled on Providence, Rhode Island, with some elements drawn from other New England communities. The name itself, Quahog, is the local New England term for a hard-shell clam, the kind that has been harvested in Rhode Island waters for centuries, the kind that appears on the state's official seal, the kind that working-class fishermen and coastal laborers have pulled from the mud since before the country existed. It is a small, stubborn coastal creature that has survived in the same waters for a very long time. The town named after it was designed to feel similarly rooted, similarly unglamorous, similarly real. The choice to name the town after a clam is worth more than a passing thought. MacFarlane was a product of New England in a genuine and specific way. He did not invent an aspirational city like Springfield, which in The Simpsons is famously placeless. It could be anywhere in America, and that ambiguity is part of its symbolic power. Quahog is different. Quahog is deliberately, specifically regional. It carries the weight of a particular kind of New England identity, Working class, Catholic adjacent, ethnically complex, quietly proud, and slightly suspicious of anything too polished or too urban or too educated. Rhode Island itself is the smallest state in the country, often treated as an afterthought by the rest of the nation, punching above its weight culturally but never quite getting full credit for it. It was the last of the original 13 colonies to ratify the Constitution, the most resistant to federal authority, the one that held out longest against the pressures of conformity and centralization. There is a stubborn, independent spirit built into Rhode Island's history that rhymes interestingly with Family Guy's own relationship to the conventions of its genre. MacFarlane grew up within driving distance of this world, observed it carefully, and then made it the setting for his examination of American family life. The choice to set the show in this specific, slightly underdog corner of the country was not random. It was a choice about who the show was for and what world it was claiming to represent. The Griffins live in a cul-de-sac on Spooner Street, in a white two-story house with a modest yard, surrounded by neighbors who are a very deliberate cross-section of late 20th century American suburban archetypes. Joe Swanson, the disabled police officer. Quagmire, the serial womanizer who works as an airline pilot. Cleveland Brown, the gentle, mild-mannered black man who would later get his own spin-off. And the Griffins themselves, right at the center. The fat father, the beautiful but bored wife, the invisible daughter, the confused son, the genius baby, the intellectual dog. Each of those neighbors is a specific comment on a specific kind of American masculinity. Joe Swanson in the early seasons was coded as the ideal of athletic, patriotic, physically capable manhood, and then gradually reduced to an object of pity and mockery as the show examined what happens to men when their ability to embody that ideal is taken from them. He was introduced in Season 1, in an episode literally titled, "A Hero Sits Next Door," as someone the whole neighborhood admired. Peter was jealous of him. The joke in that first appearance was not that Joe was disabled. The joke was that Joe, despite his wheelchair, had qualities that Peter could not match. He was admired, he was capable, he was the person people looked up to. His disability had not taken his dignity. But by the later seasons, that dignity was gone. Joe's wheelchair had become a punchline rather than a context. His wife was unhappy, his friends mocked him, the ideal that his early characterization represented had been undermined so systematically that watching an early Joe episode and a late Joe episode back-to-back feels like watching two different characters inhabit the same body. The show was doing something real with that arc, even if it did not always handle it with the care it deserved. It was showing the way that American masculinity's promises to men who dedicate themselves to service and sacrifice are not reliably kept. Quagmire represented a very particular strain of unreconstructed heterosexual male entitlement, played for laughs but also depicted with enough consistency that you could not quite escape the underlying portrait of a man who had never been asked to change and never wanted to. He worked as an airline pilot, which gave him access, mobility, and a lifestyle that insulated him from any of the domestic accountability that governed Peter and Joe's lives. He existed in a kind of perpetual adolescence of male entitlement, and the show's relationship to whether this was being celebrated or critiqued shifted continuously over the years. At its best, Quagmire was a portrait of a specific kind of arrested development, the man who is charming enough and successful enough to never face the consequences of his behavior, and who consequently never grows. The neighborhood, the street, the town, all of it was constructed as a kind of snow globe of American suburban life at the turn of the 21st century, safe on the outside, claustrophobic on the inside, everyone performing their roles with varying degrees of success. And the camera, the show itself, watching with enormous attention, enormous patience, and something that looked like affection but also contained a very sharp, very quiet anger. One of the things Quahog represents that rarely gets discussed is the way American small cities were changing during the period the show was created. The late 1990s were a time of genuine economic anxiety in places like Providence and the surrounding communities. Manufacturing jobs that had supported working-class families for generations were disappearing. The service economy was taking over, but it was not offering the same stability, the same sense that your labor built something permanent. Peter Griffin's job at a brewery, the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery, is itself a comment on this. Beer, a product that working-class men consume in enormous quantities, made by working-class men who get paid just enough to afford the thing they make. There is a loop in that image that is not accidental. Peter previously worked at the Happy-Go-Lucky Toy Factory, a name that could not be more perfectly constructed to sound like something out of an older, more innocent American dream. And then that factory's boss died. A man literally choked to death at a dinner table in front of Peter, and Peter moved on to the brewery, from toys to alcohol, from innocence to sedation, from making things for children to making things that adults use to forget they are adults. That arc, from the toy factory to the brewery, is compressed but devastating if you look at it long enough. It is the story of an economy moving from the production of something hopeful to the production of something numbing, and of a man moving with it without ever quite understanding what he lost in the transition. Quahog is, ultimately, a portrait of a place where the American promise was partially kept. People have houses, they have cars, they have jobs and bars and churches and schools. But underneath all of that, running quietly beneath everything, is the knowledge that this was supposed to feel better than it does, that the houses were supposed to mean more, that the jobs were supposed to be more fulfilling, that the families were supposed to love each other more naturally, more easily, without all the friction and cruelty and fundamental disappointment that seems to seep into every wall of every house on every quiet street. That is what Quahog really is. A beautiful lie told convincingly enough that the people living inside it mostly believe it. And Family Guy's great hidden project was to walk through every room of that lie, very slowly, and show you what was actually inside each one. Not to destroy the lie, the show was never revolutionary in that sense. It was not calling for anything to change, it was just looking. And the looking itself, sustained over 25 years and hundreds of episodes, amounts to one of the most sustained and unsparing examinations of late 20th and early 21st century American suburban life that popular culture has produced. Scholars wrote entire books about it. The academic work Family Guy and Philosophy, A Cure for the Petarded, brought together university professors, actual philosophers and sociologists, and cultural critics to examine what the show was doing underneath its surface. Their conclusion was that the show was, in its own strange way, genuinely engaged with questions of ethics and identity and the construction of American life. Not always with grace, not always with wisdom, but with a kind of relentless, energetic attention that the Academy found worthy of serious study. Section 4. Peter Griffin was never just a fool. Peter Griffin is fat. He is Irish-American. He has a beer belly and thick glasses and a Rhode Island accent, and he works at a brewery, and he drinks with his friends at a bar called the Drunken Clam, and he makes terrible decisions on a continuous basis. On the surface, he reads as a joke, a caricature, a vessel for stupid humor. But McFarlane based Peter's voice on the real voices of real working-class men he heard talking at his school. He did not invent Peter's voice from imagination. He listened, and then he captured. And what he captured, at the beginning of the show at least, was not a monster or a fool. It was something much more specific and much more quietly devastating. Peter Griffin in his earliest seasons was a portrait of a particular kind of American man who gets made, not born. He was a man formed entirely by his environment, with almost no access to any framework for examining that environment from the outside. He did not read books. He did not think philosophically. He processed the world through television, through his friends at the bar, through the inherited rhythms of his Irish Catholic working-class upbringing, and through his wife, who was smarter and more perceptive than him, and who had, for reasons the show left deliberately mysterious, chosen to build her life around him anyway. He was a man who had internalized, completely and without question, a set of ideas about what a man was supposed to be: strong, decisive, in charge of his household, capable of physical things, a good provider, a loyal friend, a presence that filled the room. Peter Griffin believed in all of these things about himself, with an absolute sincerity that was both touching and terrifying, because the gap between what he believed about himself and what he actually was enormous. And he lived in that gap every single day without ever quite being aware of it. That gap is where most of the early humor came from. Peter was not funny because he was stupid. He was funny because he was sincere. He genuinely meant well. He genuinely believed he was doing the right thing even when he was doing something catastrophically wrong. In the earliest seasons, every episode ended with him recognizing his mistake and apologizing. Not because the show was trying to be wholesome, but because that cycle, the mistake, the recognition, the apology, was doing something real. It was showing you a man who actually had a moral core, however buried under incompetence and bad judgment. a man who could be reached, a man who was capable of shame and love and the desire to be better, even if he kept failing to get there. This is the thing that the show's later treatment of Peter completely obscured, but in those first 3 seasons it was unmistakable. Peter Griffin was the show's portrait of the American everyman, and the portrait was sympathetic. Sympathetic in the way that the best portraits always are clear-eyed about the subject's failures, but not contemptuous of them. Understanding that this person's failures were partly the product of a system that had not given him the tools to be otherwise. He grew up with a deeply religious, deeply strict stepfather named Francis Griffin. He never had access to the kind of intellectual or cultural environment that might have given him broader frameworks for understanding his life. He worked jobs that asked almost nothing of his mind and everything of his physical presence. He was, in the most literal sense, a product of his world. And his world had produced in him a man who was loving and loyal and incapable of self-reflection, and who caused enormous amounts of damage to the people around him, while never quite intending to. Peter's relationship with masculinity was the show's earliest hidden argument. He was a man who had been told by everything around him, his culture, his religion, his neighborhood, his peer group, that being a man meant being strong and in charge and unquestioned. And he believed it. He performed it. He enacted it every single day. But the show kept showing you, very quietly, how damaging that performance was. How the version of manhood that Peter had been handed was one that left almost no room for vulnerability, for growth, for the admission that he did not know what he was doing. In the first episode, Death Has a Shadow, Peter gets fired from his job for being drunk at work, lies to Lois about it, fraudulently collects welfare, and then gets caught. The plot is absurd and comedic, but the underlying skeleton of it is not funny at all. It is the story of a man who cannot tell his wife the truth because the truth is a form of failure, and failure threatens the only thing he has, his sense of himself as the man of the house. The comedy is a wrapper around something much more uncomfortable, and the show's resolution, Peter apologizing, Lois forgiving, the family continuing, is not a happy ending so much as a temporary postponement of the reckoning that the family's dynamic was always quietly building toward. His full name is Peter Löwenbräu Griffin, the middle name being a German beer brand, which is either the show being absurdist or, if you want to read it generously, the show encoding its central image directly into its protagonist's identity. Peter is, by his very name, a beer man. It is baked into him, and the Löwenbräu is specifically German, specifically an imported, slightly elevated brand, not domestic, not cheap, but also not prestigious. Caught between aspirational and ordinary, in other words, just like Peter himself. His design, the round head, the bespectacled eyes, the thick build, the slight forward-leaning walk was McFarlane translating the security guards he had heard into visual form. There is a grounded quality to how Peter looks that is quite different from the kind of cartoon physics that govern other animated characters. He looks like a type of person you have actually seen, somewhere. In a bar or a hardware store or a workplace parking lot. And that groundedness, that recognizability, is what made the cruelty that the show later inflicted on him so specifically disturbing. Because when he became a genuine monster in the later seasons, you still had the memory of who he had been, this recognizable, reachable person, and the distance between those two versions was a measure of how far the show had traveled from its own earliest intentions. He was modeled in part on the working-class sitcom fathers of the 1970s and 1980s. Men like Archie Bunker, like Dan Connor from Roseanne, like Homer Simpson, who himself owed a debt to those earlier figures. But where Homer Simpson was designed to be fundamentally lovable and somewhat timeless, Peter Griffin was more specifically anchored in a time and a place and a set of anxieties that were very much of the late 1990s. The anxiety of the white working-class man who could feel his world changing around him and did not have the language to process what was happening. The anxiety of someone whose authority had always been assumed and was now, quietly and persistently, being questioned. The anxiety of a country that had been promised something and was not sure anymore whether the promise was being kept. There is also something very particular happening with Peter's relationship to his own body. Peter's weight was always deliberately significant, though it was never discussed in the kind of terms that would make the commentary explicit. His bulk was the physical manifestation of a certain kind of American excess, the beer, the fast food, the sedentary pleasures, the body that had been given what it wanted and not been asked to deny itself. But it was also a kind of armor. A physical presence that took up space in a world where taking up space was the primary currency of male authority. Peter was not thin and commanding, he was large and blundering. But he was still, within his world, the patriarch, the center of gravity that everything else orbited. And the show used that body, that large, clumsy, sometimes violent body, as a canvas for a very long and not always comfortable examination of what physical authority actually costs the people in its vicinity. The show could have made Peter thin and still stupid, or old and still stupid, or poor and still stupid. It made him fat, not randomly. The fatness meant something in the specific context of late 1990s American masculinity. It was the body of a man who had not been asked to discipline himself, who had not been required to perform health the way upwardly mobile Americans were increasingly required to, who was carrying the evidence of his pleasures in a form that was visible and unavoidable. He was a man whose interior life was written on his exterior. His appetites, his indulgences, his refusal or inability to conform to the sleeker, more aspirational body standards of the professional class, all of it was there, visible, in the character design. None of this was announced. It was not in the promotional materials for the show. It was not in the interviews Seth MacFarlane gave to promote the first season. It was just there, built into the character, available to anyone who was paying close enough attention to see it. This is what makes Family Guy, at its best, so genuinely rewarding to think about. The surface is loud and stupid and offensive, but if you are patient, if you look at what is actually under the noise, there is a very careful portrait of a very specific kind of American life, constructed with more intelligence and more intention than the show's reputation would suggest. Section 5. Brian Griffin and the loneliest character on television. Brian Griffin is a white Labrador retriever who walks upright, drinks martinis dry, drives a Prius, attends literary events, has opinions about jazz, attended Brown University, and is voiced by Seth MacFarlane using his completely unmodified, natural speaking voice. He is the only character in the entire show for whom MacFarlane does not perform. That is not a small thing. When MacFarlane voices Peter, he adopts a Rhode Island working-class accent that he built from listening to real men. When he voices Stewie, he does a theatrical British patrician drawl, inspired by classic film villains and old theatrical traditions. When he voices Quagmire, there is a specific, slightly nasal, slightly retro quality to the sound that makes him immediately distinct. But when he voices Brian, he just speaks. The way he actually speaks, in his real life, in his real voice. The character who most represents the creator is the one where the creator does not bother to perform. MacFarlane has said directly, in multiple interviews over the years, that Brian represents him more than any other character on the show. Brian's political liberalism mirrors MacFarlane's own. Brian's atheism is MacFarlane's atheism. Brian's aspirations as a serious writer, the novel he has been working on for years and cannot finish, the literary ambitions that keep colliding with commercial reality, these are drawn from MacFarlane's own experience of being a person with serious artistic ambitions, working inside a commercial entertainment machine that was not particularly interested in the serious parts. Brian attended Brown University, which is located in Providence, Rhode Island, right in the cultural shadow of the show's fictional Quahog, an Ivy League institution, a place of genuine intellectual prestige, and Brian has the degree to show for it. He just also happens to live in a working-class household as a pet. The decision to make his self-portrait a dog was, by any measure, one of the most quietly devastating creative choices in the entire history of the show. Think about what it actually means. The most intelligent, most thoughtful, most self-aware character in the Griffin household is the animal. He is not a full member of the family, not technically. He is owned by them. He lives in their house at their pleasure. He has no legal standing, no rights, no protections. He can speak, reason, feel, aspire, love, suffer, and none of it changes his fundamental position within the household's power structure. He is the property of the people he has surpassed in almost every measurable dimension of intelligence and perception. In the very first season, before the show had fully settled into what it was, there were moments with Brian that were genuinely devastating in their quietness. He was a failed writer who drank too much. He was in love with Lois, and had been for as long as he could remember. He was the most capable adult in the house, the only one who could see clearly what was happening around him, and he was also the least powerful, because his clarity cost him nothing in terms of material outcome. He could see the problem perfectly and change nothing about it. This is a very specific kind of loneliness. The loneliness of the perceptive person who is nevertheless trapped, who can articulate the dysfunction but cannot escape it, who is surrounded by people less intelligent than him but who have, by accident of birth or circumstance, more authority, more stability, more belonging. Brian understood the Griffins better than they understood themselves, and the Griffins did not particularly care. McFarlane was, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, a young, educated, politically liberal man working in Hollywood, an industry that was, on one level, deeply receptive to his talents, and on another level, consistently more interested in the lowest common denominator version of his work than in the more thoughtful things he wanted to make. He was brilliant at broad comedy. He was brilliant at delivering exactly what Fox's Sunday night audiences wanted. And somewhere inside all of that, there was a person who had more serious things to say and who was not always sure he was being given the space to say them. His most ambitious creative project after Family Guy was The Orville, a science fiction series deeply influenced by Star Trek that was an attempt to use the science fiction genre for genuine philosophical and humanist exploration. The Orville felt like what Brian Griffin would have made if Brian Griffin had been given a television production budget. Brian also carried the show's most sustained engagement with the particular pain of intellectual aspiration in working-class environments. He had gone to Brown University, an Ivy League institution sitting in Providence, Rhode Island, right in the cultural shadow of the show's fictional Quahog. He had all the markers of a certain kind of intellectual legitimacy. He read books. He had opinions about authors. He attended literary events. And he was living in a house where none of that mattered, where no one read what he wrote, where his opinions on books and politics and art were tolerated at best and laughed at most of the time. There is a sociological literature on this experience, the person with the education, but without the economic security that was supposed to come with it, who sounds different from their old community but does not quite fit in the new one. Brian Griffin was, in his earliest conception, this experience made literal, and then pushed one step further into absurdity. An animal with a graduate education, living in a working-class neighborhood, unable to fully be either thing. His alcoholism, which the show treated sometimes as a joke and sometimes with uncomfortable seriousness, was not random character color. It was the logical endpoint of that loneliness. A man or a dog who is smart enough to see his situation clearly and powerless to change it does not have many options for relief. Brian drank because the gap between his perceptions and his circumstances was too wide to stare into sober. This was, again, something McFarlane was drawing from genuine observation rather than invention. The drinking intellectual who can see the problems but cannot escape them is one of the oldest character types in American literature, from Fitzgerald's narrators to Carver's working-class men. Brian was that type, given animated form, placed in a suburban sitcom, and then surrounded by chaos that made it very easy to overlook how serious his situation actually was. And then there was his relationship with Lois. In the early seasons, Brian's love for Lois was the show's most genuinely tender storyline. He did not pursue her aggressively. He did not try to break up her marriage. He simply loved her, quietly and without resolution, the way people love things they know they cannot have. He knew she was married to Peter. He knew she had chosen Peter, which was itself a choice he could never fully understand. And he honored that choice, mostly, while the feeling stayed alive inside him like something he had learned not to touch too often. That is a very specific emotional register, the kind that most television comedies, especially animated ones, would not spend time in. The early Family Guy spent real time there. And it is one of the clearest signs that the show's earliest impulse was something more than just making people laugh. The Brian who loved Lois quietly and impractically and without hope was a character with genuine interiority. He had an inner life that the show respected enough to let exist without resolution. What happened to Brian in the later seasons, the arrogance, the hypocrisy, the cruelty, the self-pity was not a random authorial choice. It was the show dramatizing, in compressed and exaggerated form, what happens to people who possess genuine gifts when those gifts are consistently undervalued by their environment. The frustration calcifies into arrogance. The self-doubt curdles into contempt. The person who wanted to be taken seriously stops being generous about not being taken seriously and starts making others pay for it instead. Brian's later seasons were ugly, but they were not random. They were what intellectual frustration looks like when it is not resolved, and when the person carrying it does not have the self-awareness to understand what is happening to them. The Season 12 episode, Life of Brian, in which Brian is struck by a car and dies, generated an astonishing volume of public reaction. The death made national headlines and trended on social media for days. It was briefly, genuinely treated as a news story. And when Brian was brought back just 2 episodes later through a time travel device, because of course the widespread response was anger rather than relief. Not just because the show had reversed a major story development, but because the reversal confirmed what the death had always been: a rating stunt, a moment of manufactured emotion, a demonstration that the show was capable of generating the reactions associated with genuine storytelling while not actually doing the work that genuine storytelling requires. That gap between the emotional reaction the show could produce and the emotional honesty it was willing to commit to is Brian Griffin's defining story. And it is, in miniature, the story of Family Guy itself. Section 6. Stewie Griffin and the Hidden Tragedy. Stewie Griffin has an American football-shaped head, wears a red onesie, keeps ray guns and time machines in his bedroom, speaks in a refined British theatrical accent that he must have absorbed from somewhere, though no one can quite explain where, and has spent the better part of several television seasons trying to murder his own mother. Seth MacFarlane has said that he designed Stewie to represent the general helplessness of infancy through the eyes of an adult, but that is the official, tidy explanation. The one you give in interviews when someone asks you a question you could answer more honestly but have decided not to. The deeper truth about Stewie Griffin is considerably stranger and considerably more interesting. Stewie was inspired, according to MacFarlane, by classic films of Alfred Hitchcock and the cold, calculating antagonists of the James Bond film franchise. MacFarlane has specifically discussed wanting to create a sophisticated and intelligent infant with a genuinely dark sense of humor. Not dark in the sense of edgy comedy, but dark in the sense of real menace. He wanted the baby to be believably dangerous in a way that cartoon babies are not supposed to be. The comedy came from the contrast, the diaper, the high chair, the baby food, and then this magnificent, terrifying voice coming out of that tiny body with that enormous head, calmly discussing plans for world domination in between requests for his afternoon bottle. In that original conception, Stewie was doing something philosophically interesting that very few people noticed at the time. He was the only character in the show who was completely free of the show's central anxiety, the anxiety of the working-class American man who has been handed a role he did not choose and cannot quite fulfill. Stewie had no role. He had not yet been assimilated into the social machinery. He was not yet a student or an employee or a husband or a father or a neighbor. He was a baby. And in that babyhood, in that complete absence of social obligation, he was absolutely free to pursue whatever he actually wanted without any of the constraints that governed every other character in the show. His desire to kill Lois was, in this reading, not really about Lois at all. Lois was the first and most immediate representative of the social order that would eventually absorb Stewie and turn him into another version of Peter. She was the first person to put demands on him, the first person to have expectations, the first person who would, if left unchecked, slowly and lovingly transform him from a free agent into a dependent, into a child, into a student, into a worker, into a citizen. Every institution that would eventually tell Stewie who he was and what he was worth had its earliest embodiment in Lois Griffin. And Stewie, with the clarity of someone who had not yet been processed by any of it, could see this clearly and hated her for it. His plans for world domination were, from this angle, not megalomania so much as an extreme version of a very ordinary desire. The desire to be in control of your own life, to not be managed, to not be processed and categorized and assigned a role that someone else invented for you. Every baby, if they could articulate their experience, would say something not entirely unlike what Stewie was saying, just in less theatrical terms. What Stewie was doing in those first 3 seasons was giving voice, in the most operatically absurd way possible, to the infant's natural resistance to domestication, to the process by which an autonomous creature is gradually shaped into a social being. The murder plots were the comic hyperbole of something every parent knows exists in every child. The small, wordless fury of being subject to someone else's authority when your needs are not being met. MacFarlane confirmed something in the later years of the show that, once you hear it, is impossible to unhear. He has said in multiple interviews that Stewie was, from the beginning, written with the assumption that he was almost certainly gay. In one interview, MacFarlane said directly, "He originally began as this diabolical villain, but then we delved into the idea of his confused sexuality. We all feel that Stewie is almost certainly gay, and he's in the process of figuring it out for himself." The writers, MacFarlane acknowledged, treated Stewie oftentimes as if we were writing a gay character, meaning that the underlying psychology the writers were drawing from when they wrote Stewie's scenes was informed by a specific understanding of who he was that was never directly stated on screen. There was a produced but never aired episode from the original run of the show called Queer is Stewie, which would have confirmed his homosexuality directly. The show's first cancellation prevented it from ever airing. And when the show came back, MacFarlane made the decision to leave Stewie's sexuality deliberately ambiguous, describing this as a form of creative flexibility. Stewie could be coded gay in one episode, straight in another, and neither in a third, without the show being required to commit. This is not the same as genuine representation, and MacFarlane has been fairly criticized for the gap between the clear implication and the perpetual non-commitment. But as a creative choice, the ambiguity also encoded something real about the character. Stewie was designed from his earliest conception to be a character who existed outside of the fixed categories that governed everyone else in the show. He was not a type. He was not legible in the usual way. He was something that the show around him did not quite have the language to name, and that not naming this was, in its own strange way, the most honest thing about him. His football-shaped head was inspired by MacFarlane's own sketch experiments during the pitch for the Family Guy pilot, intended purely for comedic visual effect, to make the baby instantly recognizable and slightly alien. But it also made Stewie look wrong in a very specific way, like someone who was wearing the costume of a baby without being entirely convincing in the role. Which is, of course, exactly what he was. He had the body of a baby. He had the life circumstances of a baby. He did none of the things a baby was supposed to do, thought none of the thoughts a baby was supposed to think, and moved through the world of the show like a traveler in a foreign country who is only pretending to follow the local customs. This is also the experience, distilled and amplified and given comic form, of a child who knows they are different from their family and is not yet old enough to leave. Of someone sitting in a high chair at a family dinner, trapped inside a body and a role and a set of expectations that do not match what is happening inside them, performing the rituals of belonging while privately planning escape. The murder plots were the cartoon fantasy of anyone who has ever sat at a family dinner feeling like a stranger. The show eventually walked most of this back. The evil genius disappeared. The murder plots stopped. Stewie became softer, warmer, more emotionally available, more like a complicated teenager than a calculating supervillain. The Season 6 two-parter Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie was essentially a farewell to the original version of the character, allowing him, in simulation, to finally achieve what he had always plotted, only to reveal that none of it was real. It was the show acknowledging, even as it honored the original concept one last time, that it was no longer going to commit to that concept going forward. The tragedy was real, an extraordinarily original character concept, gradually smoothed into something easier to manage, but it was also, in some ways, the show enacting in miniature the same process it had been depicting all along. The process by which free and strange things are gradually made domestic and ordinary by the weight of the world they have to live in. Stewie was flanderized by exactly the same forces that flanderize everyone else. He was made safe because the world around him needed him to be safe. And in that making safe, the show lost the single most original character it had ever invented. Section 7, Meg Griffin and what the show was actually saying. Meg Griffin is the most important character in Family Guy. Not the most entertaining, not the most original, not the most beloved, but the most important. Because Meg is the place where the show's hidden argument about American life became the most visible, and also the most painful, and also the most morally compromised, depending on which season you are watching and which reading you choose to apply. In the beginning, Meg was designed as the normal one, the unremarkable one. In a family that contained an evil genius baby, a talking intellectual dog, a world-class idiot father, and a beautiful, secretly complex mother, the eldest daughter was just a regular teenager. Unpopular at school, a little boring. Wanting things she was not getting attention, friends, belonging in ways that were completely ordinary and completely human. The joke was not that Meg was contemptible. The joke was that ordinariness was, in this particular family's context, the strangest thing she could have been. She was the outsider in her own home by virtue of being the least exceptional. The name Meg is short for Margaret, a name with a certain traditional working-class New England quality to it. Not flashy, not aspirational. A solid, ordinary name for a solid, ordinary girl, and the slight diminutiveness of it, Meg, rather than Margaret, reflects the way she has been slightly reduced from whatever full thing she might have been. In the earliest seasons, Meg was voiced by Lacey Chabert, whose voice gave her a slightly more sympathetic, slightly more vulnerable quality than the Meg most people know. Mila Kunis took over the role from season 2 onward and brought a different texture to it, drier, more resigned, slightly more aware of her own situation's absurdity. Both performances were doing something real with a character the show had not quite decided how to treat, and that uncertainty actually gave early Meg a complexity that the later, more systematically abused version lost. The show gradually and then rapidly did something much darker with her. It took the ordinariness and turned it into something to be punished. It escalated the mockery from gentle to cruel, from occasional to constant, from funny to genuinely uncomfortable. By the middle seasons, Meg's function in the show had been reduced almost entirely to serving as a target. She existed so that other characters could be awful to her. She existed so that the audience could watch a person be systematically devalued and decide whether to laugh or look away. The sociological reading of this, the one that was discussed in actual academic scholarship on the show, was that Meg represented a very specific kind of social sacrifice. She was the family's lightning rod, the pressure valve, the designated recipient of all the anger and frustration and self-loathing that the other family members could not direct at themselves or at each other without the whole system collapsing. There is a genuine anthropological concept here, the scapegoat, the person whose suffering enables everyone else's coherence, whose designation as the group's least important member is not arbitrary but functional, serving the social purpose of giving the group somewhere to put things that would otherwise have no outlet. Meg was the Griffin family's scapegoat. Her abuse was not random. It was structural. It was what held the rest of them together. When, in the season 10 episode Seahorse Seashell Party, Meg finally confronted her family and articulated exactly what they had been doing to her, and then the family began to fall apart, turning on each other in the absence of their shared target. The show was accidentally revealing its own mechanism. Without Meg as the designated recipient of all that accumulated toxicity, the Griffins had nowhere to put it. The deeply troubling thing about the episode's ending, where Meg accepts her role back voluntarily to restore peace, is what it implies about how the show understood her situation. It was presenting her self-abnegation as, in some warped sense, noble, as a sacrifice willingly made. Whether or not that was the writer's intent, it is the episode's visible message. And it generated genuine, substantive anger from viewers who felt the show had revealed something about itself that it should have been more ashamed of. The episode is consistently ranked among the most disliked in the entire series. What was actually hiding in Meg's treatment, in its most charitable reading, was a sustained portrait of what American girlhood feels like when it is systematically unsupported, unseen, and unmirrored. Meg wanted to be loved. She wanted to be seen. She wanted her parents to take her seriously, her peers to accept her, the world to acknowledge that she existed and that her existence had value. These are not extraordinary desires. These are the most ordinary human desires there are. And the show put them on screen repeatedly, framed them in tragedy, and then surrounded them with laughter. The real-world dimension of this cannot be ignored. The "shut up Meg" line, Peter's dismissive, contemptuous response to his daughter, became one of the most widely used memes in internet culture for years. The show exported Meg's humiliation into the real world, gave it a catchphrase, and that catchphrase was then used by real people against real women and real girls. Mila Kunis, who gave Meg her voice for the entire run of the show after the first season, has discussed publicly that people would come up to her and deploy that catchphrase against her. The fictional cruelty had bled into reality. The show did, eventually, do some corrective work. The Simpsons crossover episode in season 13 included a moment where Meg met Lisa Simpson, who encouraged her, treated her as a full person, and helped her discover her own capabilities. In Peter's Sister, the show attempted to trace the cycle of abuse that informed Peter's treatment of Meg, connecting it to his own history of being bullied and demeaned as a child. By around season 14 and 15, the most extreme abuse had been dialed back, partly credited to the addition of more women writers to the staff who pushed back against the dynamic. But for roughly 10 seasons, the damage had been done. And the damage was not just to Meg as a character. It was to the show's ability to claim any kind of moral coherence. What the Meg dynamic revealed, more than anything else the show ever did, was the gap between what Family Guy could see and what it was willing to say about what it saw. It could see the cruelty. It depicted it with precision. But it chose, repeatedly and for a very long time, to frame that cruelty as entertainment rather than as indictment. The show knew what it was doing to Meg. It just kept doing it anyway. Section 8. The cutaway gags were never random. If you ask most people what Family Guy is famous for, they will tell you the cutaway gags. The random scene jumps. The "this is worse than the time I" setups that interrupt whatever is happening to show you something completely unrelated for anywhere between 3 seconds and 3 minutes. These are what people clip online, what people quote, what people say when they try to explain the show to someone who has never seen it. And the conventional wisdom about cutaways is that they are either brilliantly anarchic or lazily random, depending on your view of the show's overall quality. The argument for them is that they represent a specific comedic sensibility, one that mirrors the way the internet-era brain actually works, jumping between contexts and references with no requirement for logical transition. The argument against them is that they are a structural crutch that allows the show to avoid committing to real storytelling. Both of these readings miss something. The cutaway gag format was borrowed, consciously or not, from older comedic traditions. British sketch comedy, particularly the tradition of Monty Python's Flying Circus, had used the sudden, unjustified context shift as a comedic tool since the early 1970s. American television variety shows, going back to Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, had developed related techniques. The distinctive thing Family Guy did was to embed this format inside what appeared to be a conventional domestic sitcom structure, to use the cutaway as an interruption of narrative continuity within a genre that was supposedly committed to narrative continuity. This is more interesting than it sounds. The domestic sitcom, from I Love Lucy forward, was built on the premise that the family was a stable unit and that each episode would pose a challenge to that stability and then resolve it. The family's narrative continuity was the whole point. The family in the sitcom universe always recovered, always came back together, always ended the episode more or less where it started. Continuity was the genre's foundational promise. Family Guy's cutaway structure was, from the beginning, an interruption of that promise. Every time a character launched a cutaway, the family's narrative was suspended. The present moment of the show was interrupted by a completely disconnected past or imagined or hypothetical moment that had nothing to do with what was happening. And then the show cut back and continued as if the interruption had not occurred. This creates a very specific cognitive experience for the viewer. It trains you, over time, to expect discontinuity, to stop trusting in the continuity of the narrative, to understand that the story you are watching can be interrupted at any moment by something that bears no logical relationship to it, and that when the story resumes, it will simply continue without acknowledging that the interruption happened. This is the condition that people who study attention and memory describe in the context of minds that have been shaped by fragmented information environments. The brain that expects interruption, that cannot fully invest in any continuous thread because it has been trained by its environment to anticipate constant redirection. What this is describing is not just a joke format, it is a structural enactment of how traumatized or anxious memory actually functions. The way intrusive thoughts interrupt continuous experience. The way the brain, under stress, cuts away from the present to something unrelated, a memory, an image, a fantasy, and then cuts back and expects you to pick up where you were without acknowledging the gap. The cutaway format was, whether MacFarlane intended this or not, a mimetic representation of a specific psychological experience, of a mind that cannot stay in the present, of consciousness that keeps escaping its own moment. Peter Griffin, in particular, launches cutaways constantly. His brain does not work like a narrative. It works like a series of interruptions. It works like someone who cannot quite bring himself to stay in the uncomfortable present when the past or the imaginary offers a more comfortable alternative. And this is not incidental to his character. It is his character, his inability to stay in the present, to sit with consequences, to follow through on the implications of what is happening around him. This is the thing that makes him both funny and, in the later seasons, genuinely disturbing. The cutaway format and Peter Griffin's character are the same thing in two different registers. Family Guy arrived in 1999, just as the internet was becoming a genuinely mainstream American experience. YouTube launched in 2005, the same year the show returned from cancellation. And it turned out that the cutaway gag format was uniquely suited for the clip-sharing culture that YouTube enabled. A 30-second cutaway could be extracted from its episode, uploaded, and enjoyed in complete isolation from the narrative it had supposedly interrupted. It needed no context. It had, by design, very little relationship to its context anyway. It was, in structural terms, already designed to function as a standalone clip. The show had invented its optimal format for the attention economy internet before the attention economy internet had fully invented itself. Whether McFarlane and his writers were consciously designing for the clip-sharing future, or whether they were simply responding to their own creative instincts, the result was a format that turned out to be extraordinarily well adapted to the media environment that was about to reshape all of American entertainment. The Conway Twitty gag, the running bit where the show would cut to a full, unedited performance of Conway Twitty singing one of his songs, lasting for minutes at a time, with no punchline and no relationship to anything around it, was the format pushed past its extreme. When most of the audience read the Conway Twitty gag as laziness or contempt for the viewers, they were not entirely wrong. But there was also something else happening. The show was demonstrating, in the most explicit way it could manage without actually saying so, how arbitrary the cutaway format was, how interchangeable the content was, how the frame, the setup line, the cut, the return was the same regardless of what you put inside it. The Conway Twitty gag was the show interrogating itself, very bluntly, about whether it had a point, and then letting the question hang in the air, unanswered, while Conway Twitty finished his song. In 2010, the show produced 2 episodes with no cutaway gags at all, Brian and Stewie being the most celebrated. The explicit purpose, according to the show's own meta-commentary, was to demonstrate that they could, but the effect was to reveal, by contrast, how much the cutaways had been doing in every other episode. Not in terms of comedy, the cutaway-free episode was funnier and more emotionally resonant than most cutaway-heavy episodes, but in terms of time-filling. The cutaways, in their volume and their frequency, had been covering for the thinning of the underlying material. Remove them, and you had 22 minutes that actually needed to be filled with something worth watching. And the show was capable of filling them. It just mostly chose not to. Section 9. The episodes that broke through the wall of reality. Family Guy has had, across its run, a small collection of episodes that did not just use the show's format to tell stories, but genuinely broke through the surface of the show to say something directly to the people watching it. These are the episodes that fans remember not for individual jokes, but for the feeling they produced, a feeling of being briefly but unmistakably seen by something that was supposed to be entertainment. The earliest and most significant of these is the Season 8 episode Brian and Stewie, which aired in 2010. The entire episode takes place in a single bank vault where Brian and Stewie are trapped overnight after attempting to retrieve something from Brian's safety deposit box. There are no cutaway gags. There are no other characters. There is no subplot. There is nothing except 2 characters alone talking to each other. And what they say to each other across the course of that 22 minutes is genuinely startling. Brian reveals that the reason he has a safety deposit box is that he keeps a gun in it, because there are times when life feels so impossible, so painful, so without sufficient reason to continue, that he wants to have the option available to himself. He is describing suicidal ideation in a cartoon, on network television, in an episode of Family Guy. The moment is not played for laughs. There is no cutaway to deflect from it. The show just sits inside the disclosure and lets it be what it is. Stewie's response to this revelation is played with complete seriousness. He is horrified. He is grief-stricken. He tells Brian that he cannot do this, that his absence would be devastating, that he needs him in a way that has nothing to do with jokes or entertainment or the surface relationships the show usually depicts. It is a declaration of love, not romantic love, but the profound, necessary love that exists between 2 people who have decided, in whatever terms are available to them, that they are essential to each other's continued existence in the world. The episode was unprecedented in the show's history and remains, by consensus among fans and critics who care about the show's better moments, its single finest achievement. It proved that the format was capable of something the show had been mostly too commercial and too risk-averse to attempt: genuine emotional honesty, sustained for a full episode, without deflection. Then there were the episodes that turned out to be accidentally prophetic. The documented cases of Family Guy appearing to anticipate real-world events before they happened are more numerous than casual viewers might expect, and the list is strange enough that even the skeptical part of your brain has to slow down and sit with it for a moment. In 2005, a Family Guy episode featured baby Stewie running naked through a shopping mall screaming that he had escaped from Kevin Spacey's basement. 12 years later, in 2017, Kevin Spacey became the subject of widespread sexual abuse allegations. The joke in 2005 was targeting what was apparently an open secret in the entertainment industry, one that enough people knew about to make the reference legible as a joke to those in the know, but that had not yet become public knowledge for the general audience. The writers were not predicting the future. They were paying attention to the present in ways that most people were not. In 2009, an episode featured Stewie expressing disbelief that Brody Jenner was born to someone like Bruce Jenner, calling Bruce an elegant, beautiful Dutch woman. 6 years later, in 2015, Caitlyn Jenner came out publicly as a trans woman. Again, this was industry awareness of something that was known in certain circles well before it became a news story. The writers were not prophets. They were well-connected people who paid close attention to what was being discussed in the spaces they moved through. In March 2013, an episode featuring a cutaway of Peter driving through the Boston Marathon aired on Fox. Less than a month later, the Boston Marathon bombing occurred. The episode was pulled from rotation after the bombing. It was not a prediction of any specific event. It was simply the show using a famous Boston public event as a setting in a way that looked horrifyingly different in the aftermath of what happened. The proximity was genuinely coincidental, and the show handled the aftermath with appropriate sensitivity. These moments, collectively, are evidence of something more mundane but more interesting than genuine prescience. The writers of Family Guy were paying extraordinary attention to the world around them. They were reading the room, constantly, across multiple rooms simultaneously. They were noticing what others looked past, tracking patterns in public figures' behavior, monitoring conversations that happened in industry spaces that most viewers did not have access to. The show was always, at some level, a surveillance operation disguised as a cartoon, looking out at America very carefully, noting what it saw, hiding the notes and jokes. And occasionally, what the notes recorded turned out to be more immediately relevant to what was about to happen than anyone could have known when the episode aired. Section 10. What the show said about America. Family Guy began its life in 1999, at the tail end of the most prosperous decade America had experienced in the post-war era. The 1990s were, in terms of economic statistics, genuinely good for a lot of people. Unemployment was low. The stock market was extraordinary. The internet was creating new wealth in ways that seemed to have no upper limit. But there was another America running alongside that optimistic narrative. The America of the factory towns that had been hollowing out since the 1970s. The America of communities where manufacturing jobs had been exported and replaced by nothing of equivalent stability or dignity. The America of working-class men who had built their identities around a specific kind of labor and a specific kind of masculine purpose that was disappearing from under them without announcement or apology. Peter Griffin was a citizen of this other America, not of the prosperous, tech-boom, optimistic America of the 1990s, of the worried America, the confused America, the America that was not sure whether it was winning or losing, that had a house and a car and a job but felt, somehow, like something important was slipping away that nobody was quite naming. McFarlane described the show to the BBC as a modern vaudeville. Vaudeville was, historically, a working-class entertainment form. It did not require education to enjoy. It did not ask you to appreciate subtle literary references or engage with complex ideas. It gave you broad performances, physical comedy, music, novelty acts, and the pleasure of being in a large room with other people watching something together. It was democratic, in the purest sense of the word entertainment, that belonged to everyone because it made no demands on anyone. Family Guy's surface identity as a lowbrow entertainment was, in this reading, part of its social argument. It was a show that was accessible to the same working-class audiences it was satirizing. It did not require you to be educated to laugh at it. You could watch it at the end of a long shift and be entertained. And somewhere inside that entertainment, without being asked to notice, you were also looking at a portrait of your life that was sharper and more critical than anything you might have sought out intentionally. This is the great tradition of satire that works on multiple levels simultaneously. The people with the education to read the layers can read them. The people without that education can enjoy the surface. The critique is delivered through the form, not in spite of it. Family Guy, at its best, was doing exactly this. The absurd jokes were not incidental to the social criticism. They were the vehicle for it. The show's engagement with religion, driven by MacFarlane's own confirmed atheism and channeled primarily through Brian, was its most explicitly philosophical dimension. God appeared in Family Guy as a lazy, slightly contemptible figure who was not particularly interested in the welfare of his creation. Jesus showed up as a friendly but ineffectual person trying to navigate a world that had mostly moved past him. These portrayals generated enormous and sustained controversy, but the controversy itself was part of the point. MacFarlane was using the show to argue, with the force of repetition and the permission granted by comedy, that the religious assumptions underlying American social life deserved to be questioned, not gently, loudly and irreverently, in prime time, in front of as many people as would tune in. The political commentary that ran through the show's later seasons, primarily through Brian, carried a consistent underlying argument that the America being presented on screen was failing a significant portion of its own people, and that the cheerful suburban exterior of places like Quahog was a mechanism of concealment for that failure. The nice houses and the steady jobs and the bar with the friends and the football on Sundays, all of these were real, and also not enough. The gap between what was real and what was enough was the space the show had been living in since 1999. MacFarlane's 2021 public statement on social media expressing discomfort with Family Guy being on Fox given that network's association with Fox News, comparing his relationship with the network to a failing marriage, was a moment of unusual transparency. It was the creator of one of network television's longest-running shows saying, in public, that the values of his show and the values of the network that aired it had diverged beyond the point of comfortable cohabitation. That a liberal atheist social satire was airing on the platform most associated with reinforcing the assumptions that satire was criticizing. The tension had always been there. MacFarlane had just finally decided to say it out loud. The show had been signed to a major renewal deal in April 2025, extending through season 27 through the 2028 to 2029 television season, coinciding with the show's 30th anniversary. The business machine had made its calculations and decided that Family Guy was worth continuing, regardless of what the ratings said, because the show's value was not in its first-run viewership numbers, but in its streaming, residuals, its merchandise revenue, its global licensing, the enormous library of content it had produced over 3 decades that continued to generate income across every platform and in every territory where American animation had an audience. Family Guy had become, in other words, exactly the thing that Peter Griffin worked at. A product. Made by workers in a factory. Valued not for what it meant, but for what it could be sold for. The irony is complete and possibly intentional, and almost certainly not noticed by most of the people involved in producing it. Section 11. Lois Griffin and the woman nobody was watching. It is very easy, in a show this loud and this chaotic, to overlook the woman at the center of it. Lois Griffin does not have the buffoonish visibility of Peter. She does not have the philosophical weight of Brian. She does not have the theatrical distinctiveness of Stewie. She does not have the cultural resonance of Meg. She is, in some ways, the least discussed major character in the show. And this is, possibly, deliberate. Lois Griffin was born into money. Her parents, Carter and Barbara Pewterschmidt, are extraordinarily wealthy, and Lois's upbringing was a world away from the working-class neighborhood she ended up living in. She is classically trained as a piano player. She is more educated than her husband. She is more intelligent than her husband. She is, by almost any measure of conventionally valued attainment, the more capable adult in the Griffin household. And she chose Peter. The show never quite explains this, and when it gestures toward explanations, they are always slightly unsatisfying. There is a sense that Lois chose Peter partly in rebellion against her family's expectations. Her father Carter is domineering and dismissive, and choosing an Irish Catholic working-class man to marry was the most direct form of rejection available to her. Partly out of genuine love for his simple, warm, uncomplicated affection in the early years of their relationship, partly because of qualities he had before the passage of time and the pressures of working-class life wore them down into something harder to see. Whatever the reason, she made the choice. She has been living inside it ever since. The hidden argument of Lois's character is not really about her choice of Peter. It is about what happened to her after that choice. Lois Griffin was a woman with genuine talents, genuine intelligence, and genuine ambition who was slowly absorbed by a domestic role that did not ask anything of those qualities. She taught piano lessons from home, which was about the most contained and low-stakes use of her skills imaginable. She managed the household, which was less an act of management than a form of continuous damage control in the aftermath of Peter's latest disaster. She was the smart person who cleaned up after the less smart person endlessly, without the arrangement ever being named or examined by anyone in the household, least of all her. Her occasional moments of darkness, the episodes where a colder, more calculating, more ruthlessly self-interested Lois surfaced briefly before being submerged again, were not random character complexity. They were the predictable result of a specific kind of suppression. The person whose genuine capacities are not being used, who is performing a role that underutilizes everything interesting about her, pressing against the edge of her constructed life to see what is on the other side. Alex Borstein, who has voiced Lois since the show's first episode, has brought to the character a quality of suppressed energy that rewards attention. There is something in the way Borstein plays Lois's patience, a slightly stretched quality to it, an awareness of cost that suggests a performer who understood what the character was actually doing even when the scripts did not quite name it. Lois was holding the Griffins together by continuous, uncredited effort, and Borstein played that effort as real even when the show treated it as invisible. In the early seasons, there were moments where the show seemed about to do something more interesting with Lois. There were glimpses of the kind of person she might have been in a different life, with a different partner, in a world that had found uses for her actual capabilities. These glimpses were never developed into anything more sustained. Lois remained, at her core, the woman who made the Griffin family possible by absorbing everything it demanded of her and asking for very little in return. The most interesting character the show never quite wrote. The hidden load-bearing wall of a house that was always one earthquake away from falling down. There is a reading of Lois Griffin that positions her as the show's most honest portrait of a specific kind of American woman. Highly capable, well-educated, with a former life that contained real ambition and real achievement, who made a choice that swapped those things for something else, love, perhaps, or belonging, or the specific pleasures of the domestic life she had been told she was supposed to want and has been living inside that trade ever since, mostly without regret but not entirely without awareness of what she gave up. This is not a tragic portrait. It is a very human one. It is the portrait of someone who made a real choice and is living with real consequences in a show that mostly did not have the attention to look at her closely enough to render those consequences with the detail they deserved. Section 12. The show that knew itself and kept going. Anyway, there is a moment in the Season 10 episode Back to the Pilot where Brian and Stewie travel back in time to the very first episode of Family Guy. And while they are there, they watch the characters in the pilot standing perfectly still during a cutaway gag, frozen, waiting for it to be over, doing absolutely nothing because there is nothing for them to do while the cutaway plays out. The show was, in that moment, looking directly at itself, acknowledging, in the most Family Guy way possible through self-parody, through a joke, the exact structural problem that its critics had been pointing at for years. The characters have nothing to do during the cutaways. They just wait. The story stops. The people inside the story wait for the interruption to pass. This is what meta-commentary looks like when a show uses it honestly. Not to deflect criticism, not to perform cleverness about its own limitations, but to name the limitation clearly and then make you feel, in the naming of it, something that feels almost like compassion for the show itself. The show was trapped inside the form it had built. The characters were trapped waiting for cutaways to end. The people watching were trapped between laughing at individual moments and being unable to remember the actual plot 5 minutes after it ended. And the show kept going anyway. Because here is the thing that connects every hidden layer we have looked at tonight. What Family Guy was doing, all along, was not so different from what the Griffin family was doing, staying in a situation that was not working as well as it once had. performing a role that no longer quite fit, going through the motions of a version of itself that had been more vital at an earlier stage, with enough residual energy and enough genuine occasional moments of brilliance to justify continuing. Peter Griffin, trapped in a job and a neighborhood and a version of masculinity that were increasingly inadequate. Brian Griffin, trapped in a body and a household that underutilized everything he had to offer. Stewie Griffin, trapped between the villain he was designed to be and the gentler, safer character the show needed him to become. Meg Griffin, trapped in the role of the family's least important member, accepting that designation because the alternative was to watch everything fall apart. Lois Griffin, trapped in the domestic arrangements she had chosen and was too exhausted, too loving, too invested to leave. And the show itself, trapped in its own success, trapped by the fact that it had invented a format that was brilliant and then used that format so often and so mechanically that it became a crutch. Trapped between the thing it had been in its best seasons and the thing it had become in the service of continuing to exist. Trapped by the very fact that it worked, that people kept watching, that the business model kept functioning, that there was no forcing mechanism to stop and ask whether the thing being produced was still worth producing. The April 2025 announcement of a multi-season renewal deal with Disney that would keep the show going through season 27, through the 2028 to 2029 television season, through the show's 30th anniversary. This was not an artistic decision. It was a spreadsheet conclusion. MacFarlane himself, in a 2024 interview, described the show's continued existence in terms of financial utility and audience demand rather than creative passion. He noted that it made people happy, that it funded causes he cared about like environmental conservation through organizations like Rainforest Trust. He framed it as something that had achieved what he called escape velocity, having run long enough that there was no logical reason to stop unless the audience disappeared. This is a very different energy from the 25-year-old who pitched a 15-minute pilot to Fox in 1998, bursting with specific ideas about a specific family in a specific town. But the strange, sad, beautiful thing about Family Guy is that the hidden layers were always there, even in its most exhausted seasons. Even in its most commercial, most careless, most lazy episodes. The architecture was still underneath it all. The Griffins were still in that house on Spooner Street. The show was still, however faintly, carrying the original signal that MacFarlane had embedded in it at the beginning. The portrait of a family trying to hold together in a world that was not particularly well designed for families. The portrait of a man who had been given one version of what it meant to be good and was failing, continuously, to live up to it. The portrait of a dog who knew better and drank too much. The portrait of a baby who had not yet been told who he was supposed to be and was mourning the loss of that freedom in advance. This is, in miniature, the story of America that Family Guy was always telling. The story of people and systems that are not quite working as advertised, that are going through familiar motions with diminishing conviction, that are sustained not by genuine vitality, but by inertia and sunk costs, and the difficulty of imagining anything different. The show about American working-class life became, in its later seasons, a working-class show in a new and unintended sense. A show that punched in, did its hours, collected its paycheck, and went home. Just like Peter Griffin. Just like the people in the brewery. Just like the whole tired, functional, slightly exhausted organism that is 21st century suburban American life. The hidden argument of Family Guy, if you sit with it long enough, if you listen to all the noise long enough to hear the signal underneath it, is this: we are all more trapped than we know. We are all performing roles that were chosen for us more than by us. We are all waiting for cutaways to end and finding that when they do, we are right back where we started, and we keep going anyway, and the show keeps going anyway. And the joke, if it is a joke, is that going on is the only thing any of us know how to do. Seth MacFarlane almost died on September 11th, 2001. He missed his flight by 10 minutes. He has been alive for every year of Family Guy's existence because of a hangover and a travel agent's mistake. The show that came from him, the 25 years of Griffins and cutaways and chicken fights, and Sunday night animations and Wednesday night animations and all the seasons and the spin-offs and the merchandise and the streaming rights was made by a man who knew, better than most, that the difference between being here and not being here is sometimes smaller than a miscommunication. Maybe that is why the show, even at its most outrageous, even at its most mean and its most exhausted, always contained somewhere inside it a longing for something warmer. The early seasons ended with hugs, with apologies, with Peter recognizing, despite everything, that he had been wrong and trying to say so. Those moments were not cheap. They were not just sitcom formula. They were the show telling you what it was really about in the few seconds between the chaos and the credits. A man who causes damage and then, imperfectly and incompletely and often unsuccessfully, tries to repair it. A family that is a mess and knows it is a mess and stays anyway. An American life that is not what it was supposed to be and is lived in anyway, with as much love as the people living it can manage. The family kept going. The show kept going. America kept going. And buried inside all of that going, underneath all of the noise and the cutaway gags and the shock value and the years of diminishing returns, the thing that started it all was still there. A man in Connecticut who grew up thinking carefully about the world around him, who went to art school in Rhode Island and listened to the working men who walked past him on campus, who built a cartoon from what he heard, and who put inside that cartoon every honest thing he knew about what it felt like to be alive in this specific country at this specific time. That is what Family Guy was hiding. Not a conspiracy, not a secret code, something more fragile and more honest than either of those things. The belief, stubborn and perhaps irrational, that it mattered to keep showing up, that the mess was worth staying inside, that somewhere in the chaos was something real enough to be worth the effort of looking for it. Close your eyes now, if they are not already closed. Let the rest of it go quiet. The show is still out there. The Griffins are still in that house on Spooner Street, and somewhere in the static and the cutaways and all the years of television that never quite lived up to what it promised, there is a signal, a person talking to you from underneath all the noise. Not loudly, not clearly, but persistently, the way real things always do. You just have to be still enough to hear it. If you made it all the way through this one, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below. Tell me what surprised you, what you already knew, what you see differently now. And if you are not yet subscribed, this is the moment. It costs you nothing and it helps more than I can adequately explain. Sleep well wherever you are. Thank you for watching. Section 13. The music nobody talked about. There is a dimension of Family Guy that almost never makes it into serious conversation about what the show was doing, and it is one of the most revealing things about Seth MacFarlane's genuine intentions. The music, the original songs, the elaborate musical sequences, the parodies of Broadway and film scores that appeared across the show's run with a frequency and a technical quality that no other animated comedy on network television ever matched. MacFarlane is, genuinely and substantially, a trained musician. He plays piano. He sings in a style that evokes the big band jazz era, the Frank Sinatra era, the lush orchestral film scores of the mid-20th century that filled cinema screens before rock music rewrote the popular ear. He has released multiple albums of jazz standards that sold respectably and were received with genuine, if slightly baffled, critical warmth. When he performed at awards shows or special events, he performed live with a full band in a style that was so aggressively unfashionable for the 2000s and 2010s that it circled back around to being interesting. This is not background information. This is foundational to understanding what Family Guy was doing every time it broke into song. The musical sequences in Family Guy served a function that cutaway gags served poorly. They allowed the show to access emotional registers that its normal mode, the sarcastic, irreverent, reference-dense comedy actively blocked. When Peter sang about his love for Lois, the joke was the incongruity of a man like Peter having those feelings and expressing them so directly. But underneath the joke was the feeling itself, and the feeling was real. When Brian and Stewie performed a song together and their vocal performances, both provided by MacFarlane, they were technically excellent. The warmth of the duet cut through the ironic distance the show normally maintained, and let you feel for a moment that these characters genuinely cared about each other. MacFarlane used music as a smuggling device. The same way a magician uses misdirection, he used comedy to get your guard down, and then used music to deliver the feeling that the comedy alone could never have reached. The emotional moments that landed most powerfully in Family Guy's best seasons almost always had a musical component, even a brief one. A melody under a scene, a character singing something sincere in the middle of an otherwise ridiculous episode. The show's most famous recurring musical element was the theme song, a sophisticated piece of big band orchestration that was, for an animated sitcom on Fox in 1999, extraordinarily unusual. The theme established immediately that, whatever this show was, it had musical ambitions that were somewhat at odds with its visual style. The bombastic, cheerful, slightly old-fashioned energy of the theme sat in fascinating tension with the show's contemporary irreverence. It was like finding a jazz record inside a hip-hop album's sleeve. The writers who came on board after MacFarlane's involvement diminished in the early 2010s used music less frequently and less effectively. The songs became parodies more often than originals, references more often than genuine emotional gestures. And with that shift, one of the show's most reliable pathways into actual feeling was narrowed. The musical dimension of Family Guy is the clearest evidence that the people who built it were capable of more than the people who later ran it. And the absence of that dimension in the later seasons is one of the clearest signs of what was lost when the creator stepped back. Section 14. The chicken fights and what they were about. There is a running gag in Family Guy that began in the Season 2 episode Da Boom and recurred, with escalating absurdity and escalating duration throughout the show's run. Peter Griffin encounters a giant human-sized chicken named Ernie, and the two of them engage in an extraordinarily violent extended fight that destroys enormous amounts of property and infrastructure before ending inconclusively. And then, a season or two later, the fight happens again. And again. And again. The chicken fights are widely discussed as one of the show's signature bits, and most conversation about them treats them as pure spectacle as the show, proving it could produce elaborate, extended action animation, as a joke about the persistence of grudges, as a demonstration of Peter's incapacity to simply walk away from conflict. All of these readings are present. But there is something else happening in those fights that rarely gets named. The chicken is, according to the show's own internal logic, a result of a miscommunication. Ernie gave Peter a coupon that turned out to be expired. Peter was offended. The chicken was offended that Peter was offended. And from that moment, rooted in a trivial commercial transaction gone wrong, the two of them have been locked in periodic combat that has destroyed several city blocks, damaged multiple vehicles, interrupted important events, and caused significant civilian disruption. This is the show's portrait of masculine pride and its consequences, rendered in the most ridiculous possible form. Two men who cannot let go of an insult that neither fully remembers the origin of, who keep re-encountering each other and restaging the same confrontation because neither is capable of the self-reflection required to say, "This is not worth fighting about." The chicken fights are funny because they are absurd. But the absurdity is the absurdity of actual human behavior, enlarged to cartoon scale and played for spectacle instead of for discomfort. Every time Peter sees the chicken, he has the option to simply walk away. He never takes it, and the show never quite asks why. It just shows you, over and over, two creatures locked in a pattern of conflict neither of them chose to end, causing escalating damage to everything around them while the actual reason for the conflict becomes increasingly irrelevant. This is also what Peter's relationship with Lois looks like in many of the later seasons, what his relationship with his friends looks like, what his relationship with the world looks like. A series of encounters that should have simple resolutions, extended by pride and thoughtlessness, and the inability to back down into elaborate, damaging performances of conflict that settle nothing and hurt everyone nearby. The chicken fights were not just spectacle. They were the show's clearest visual representation of the thing that was quietly destroying everything Peter was supposed to love. Section 15. What happens when a show understands itself? There is a final hidden thing about Family Guy that I want you to carry with you out of this video, because it is the thing that, once you see it, makes every other reading snap into a sharper focus. Family Guy is a show that, at its core, is about the gap between who people are and who they tell themselves they are. Peter is not the good father he believes himself to be. Brian is not the intellectual he presents himself as. Stewie is not the detached, calculating villain he performs so elaborately. Meg is not the person her family has decided she is. Lois is not simply the patient wife. None of them are the version of themselves they are performing, and the show's deepest and most consistent project present from the very first episode, maintained across every season, visible in the spaces between the jokes, was to make that gap visible without ever quite calling attention to itself. It did this by being a show that also had a gap between what it told itself it was and what it actually was. It told itself it was a lowbrow comedy, a modern vaudeville, a show about random jokes and irreverent gags, and it was those things. But it was also, all along, something with more intention than it admitted. Something that cared more than it let on. Something that was hiding its intelligence inside its stupidity, hiding its feelings inside its jokes, hiding its genuine social commentary inside its outrageous offensiveness. The show understood something about camouflage that its characters never did. Peter Griffin didn't know how to hide his damage. It leaked out of him in every episode. Brian did not know how to hide his loneliness. Stewie did not know how to hide his confusion. Meg did not know how to hide her pain. But the show they lived in knew exactly how to hide all of it inside laughter, inside absurdity, inside the protective coating of a joke. Maybe that is the most human thing about it. The way people hide their real feelings inside performances that seem to be about something else. The way families talk around the things that matter most. The way cultures develop elaborate entertainments to process anxieties they cannot face directly. Family Guy was an anxiety processing machine, built to look like a comedy, doing something much stranger and much more honest underneath the surface. And now, 25 years later, the machine is still running. The Griffins are still in their house. The cutaways are still interrupting the stories. The chicken and Peter are still fighting somewhere, for reasons neither of them quite remembers. And somewhere underneath all of it, the signal is still there. Fainter now, maybe, but present. Waiting to be heard by anyone patient enough to listen. That is what Family Guy was really hiding the entire time. Not a secret. Not a conspiracy, just the truth, dressed up in noise, waiting for someone to ask it to take off its costume. Sleep well. Extended appendix. Going deeper into each Griffin. There is more to say about each member of this family than any single video can hold. But because this one is designed to let you drift, to let the ideas wash over you slowly, to give you something substantial enough to actually lose yourself in, I want to go back through each major character one more time and add the details that the main sections left out. Think of this as the second layer, the one that opens up after the first reading is finished. Peter Griffin has a middle name that most people forget about. His full name is Peter Lowenbro Griffin Sr., with the senior indicating that somewhere in the show's internal mythology, there was intended to be a Peter Jr. who has never meaningfully appeared. The senior designation is doing something subtle. It positions Peter as a patriarch in a line of patriarchs, as the continuation of something that came before him and the origin of something that will follow. He is not just a man. He is a generational link. And the question the show never quite asks but is always quietly gesturing toward is, what exactly is being passed down through these men, through these generations of Peter Griffins, and whether it is something that should be passed down at all? His Irish Catholic identity, which the show invokes primarily through his relationship with his strict religious stepfather Francis, is another layer that gets under-examined. The Irish Catholic working-class man of the American Northeast carries a very specific historical burden. A community that came to America as immigrants, as refugees from a colonized country experiencing mass starvation, who were initially treated with enormous hostility by the existing American population, who built their identity in this new country around hard physical labor, the Catholic Church, the Democratic Party, and a fierce, sometimes violent loyalty to their own community. Peter Griffin is the descendant of those men, which means he is also the descendant of their anxieties about displacement, about being unwanted, about having to fight for belonging in a country that initially did not want to give it to them. This history does not justify Peter's cruelties, but it contextualizes them. The defensiveness, the aggressive humor, the difficulty with vulnerability, the tendency to assert authority in ways that are clumsy and harmful, these are traits that have a cultural genealogy. They did not come from nowhere. They came from somewhere. From a specific community's specific historical relationship with marginalization and the particular forms of toughness that marginalization produces. Peter Griffin is the end of a very long line. The show never tells you what the beginning of that line looked like, but if you know the history, you can see the shape of it. Lois's maiden name is Pewterschmidt, which is an aggressively upper-class WASP surname Protestant, Anglo-Saxon, the kind of name that appears on the brass plaques of New England institutions. She came from old money. She married a working-class Irish Catholic man. The cultural distance between those two worlds, in the New England context in which the show is set, is significant enough that the choice would have registered as a genuine statement, not just in her family but in the broader social context of the town. The Protestant establishment marrying the Irish immigrant's grandson. The country club world and the drunken clam world united in one household, and all the friction that generates the friction that Lois absorbs, mostly in silence, because absorbing friction is what the women in that household have always been asked to do. Brian's full name is never given in the show beyond Brian Griffin, which reinforces his status as property. He has taken his owner's surname, because he has no surname of his own, no independent lineage, no family history that is his to claim. His mother is named Biscuit and died in a tragic way that the show handles, in later seasons, with surprising sincerity. The episode in which Brian visits the farm where he was born and meets his mother, only to watch her be put down, is one of the most unexpectedly moving sequences in the entire show. It gave Brian a backstory that the show mostly preferred not to dwell on, that he is a creature who has been separated from his origins, who lives among people who are not his people, who is performing a kind of belonging that is never quite real because the foundation of belonging, knowing where you came from, having people who share that origin has been removed from him. Brian's failed novel is one of the show's most sustained and most honest jokes. It is honest because it is not really a joke. Every writer who has started a novel and not finished it, who has lived for years with the weight of an unfinished work and the specific shame of not having finished it, recognizes something real in Brian's situation. The novel is always almost done. The novel is always just needing one more revision. The novel will definitely be finished soon. The novel is a shorthand for every version of the self you have been promising to become and have not yet managed to become. Brian's novel is the most human thing about him, and it is treated as a punchline because the show knows that treating it seriously would be too uncomfortable. For Brian, and for anyone in the audience who has their own version of Brian's novel sitting somewhere on a shelf or a hard drive, waiting, Stewie's relationship with his teddy bear, Rupert the Worn, loved, anthropomorphized stuffed animal that Stewie carries everywhere and treats as a living being, is the most tender element of his original characterization. In the later seasons, when Brian destroys Rupert in a moment of drunken frustration, the show frames this as a moment of genuine loss. Stewie's grief over Rupert is real grief, even in the context of a comedy, because what Rupert represents is real. The transitional object, the thing a child uses to manage the anxiety of being separate from their caregivers, the object that absorbs all the love and terror of early childhood and holds it safely. Rupert is the evidence that underneath the elaborate villainy, underneath the world domination plots and the death rays, Stewie is still, in whatever way that matters, a one-year-old child who is scared of the dark and needs something to hold. Chris Griffin, the middle child, is perhaps the most underwritten of the major Griffins, and the underwriting is itself interesting. He is awkward, confused, sexually aware in a way that the show finds endlessly uncomfortable, and creatively talented in ways that nobody in his family particularly acknowledges or nurtures. He draws. He has genuine artistic instincts. In several episodes, his artistic ability surfaces as something more than a character note, as something that might, in a different environment, be developed into something real. But he is a Griffin, which means his talent is surrounded by chaos, and the chaos is louder than the talent, and the talent accordingly goes nowhere. Chris is the family member who might have been different, given a different environment. The show does not dwell on this because the show is a comedy and not a tragedy, but the fact of it is there, quiet and consistent, across his entire arc. Meg's most revealing quality, the one that the show's sustained cruelty obscures but does not erase, is her loyalty. She is, despite everything, fiercely loyal to her family. She protects them from external threats. She absorbs internal ones. She comes back, episode after episode, to a household that has spent the previous 22 minutes demonstrating that it does not deserve her. And she comes back not from stupidity or from masochism, but from something much more complicated, the particular love that children have for their families, which persists independent of whether it is earned, which does not require reciprocity to survive, which holds on to the idea of belonging even when the belonging has been mostly withdrawn. Meg loves her family in the way that the show's creators seemed unable to see clearly, not as a victim loves her tormentors, but as a person loves the place that formed them, damaged and imperfect and impossible to simply stop caring about. The show that made Meg a punchline was showing you, without meaning to, something genuinely important about the nature of familial love, that it persists in conditions that should not support it, that it is not rational, that it does not require reciprocity to survive, that people keep coming back to houses that have not always been kind to them because the houses are still, in spite of everything, where they learned what the world was. That is not a funny observation. That is a devastating one. And Family Guy put it on screen in the form of a character it treated as a joke for 25 years. The show understood its own characters better than it knew what to do with. It saw them clearly. It depicted them honestly, at least in its better moments. And then it laughed at what it saw, because laughter was the tool it had been given, and because the alternative sitting with the recognition, letting it land, not deflecting into a cutaway would have required the show to be something other than what it was. That gap, between what the show could see and what it was willing to feel, is the real hidden thing. The secret inside the secret. The thing that explains why Family Guy, at its best, was genuinely affecting, and why, at its worst, it was genuinely uncomfortable. It was a show that saw its own humanity and kept putting a joke in front of it, using laughter as a kind of protective coloration, because the alternative was to simply look at what was there and let it be real. That is not unique to Family Guy. That is what comedy is, at its most honest. The thing that cannot be said directly, said sideways. The feeling that cannot be expressed plainly, expressed in absurdity. The truth that is too painful to acknowledge head-on, acknowledged obliquely, in the middle of a joke about a giant chicken fight. And if you have been awake through all of this, if you are still here at the end of this long, quiet journey through a show that pretended to be simple, thank you for staying. Thank you for listening closely enough to hear what was underneath all the noise. Now let it go. Let your eyes close. Let the Griffins have their house and their street and their small Rhode Island town, and let the show keep running in whatever form it takes. The hidden things will still be there tomorrow. They have been there for 25 years. They will be there whenever you want to go back and look again. Sleep well. The long tail why it mattered that we kept watching. Here is something I find genuinely strange and genuinely beautiful about the way Family Guy existed in the world. It was one of the first shows to be brought back from cancellation by audience demand that expressed itself through a medium the networks had not yet figured out how to measure. The DVD sales. The Adult Swim reruns that dominated late-night cable ratings. The word of mouth that spread through the early internet, through forums and chat rooms and the early versions of the platforms that would eventually become the entire architecture of how we discuss entertainment. Family Guy came back in 2005 because people wanted it back badly enough to make that want measurable. And the measurement happened in ways that were new, not Nielsen ratings, not phone surveys, but purchasing behavior and viewership of reruns and online conversation. The show's resurrection was, in retrospect, an early preview of how audience demand would eventually reshape the entire economics of television. It was the first show to be saved by what we would now call streaming behavior, even before streaming existed. The DVDs were the streaming. The Adult Swim reruns were the algorithm-driven recommendations. The fan communities keeping the conversation alive were the review aggregators and the social media discourse that now determine which shows survive and which do not. The show that returned in 2005 was returning to a world that it had, in a small but real way, helped to create. A world where the audience's relationship to content was becoming active rather than passive. Where people were not just watching what was put in front of them, but were choosing, assembling, advocating for the things they wanted to keep. Family Guy taught Fox that its audience was not passive. That there were people out there who cared enough about this specific show to spend money on it, to watch it repeatedly, to talk about it in the spaces the network could not directly monitor, and to make enough collective noise that ignoring them became commercially incoherent. This matters to the hidden history of the show because it means that Family Guy's resurrection was itself an act of cultural negotiation. The fans who brought the show back were bringing back something specific the show as they had remembered it, as they had watched it in reruns and on DVD, as it existed in their memory of its best seasons. They were voting for a version of Family Guy that, by the time the votes were counted and the new episodes were being made, was already slightly in the past. The show that returned was never quite the show that the audience was voting to bring back. It was close enough, but the gap was there from the beginning, and it widened over time, until the show that the audience had loved so much they had brought it back from the dead was unrecognizable to the people who had voted to revive it. This is, again, a specifically American story. The story of nostalgia as a motivating force, and of the gap between the object of nostalgia and the actual object. The thing you loved was real. The love was real. But the thing, when recovered, is never quite the same as the thing you loved. Because what you loved was partly the thing itself, and partly who you were when you loved it, and that second part cannot be recovered. The show came back. But the specific combination of show plus audience plus moment that made it special in the first place, that particular window, those particular seasons, the experience of watching it when it was new and strange, and still figuring out what it wanted to be that was gone. And all the petitions and DVD purchases in the world could not bring it back, because it had not been taken by cancellation. It had been taken by time. The people who watched Family Guy in 1999 and 2000 and 2001, in those first 3 seasons before Fox moved it around and eventually canceled it, those people watched something that no later viewer ever quite got to see. A show that was genuinely new, genuinely uncharted, genuinely in the process of discovering what it was. A show that had not yet settled into the patterns that would eventually define and then confine it. A show where the characters had not yet been given their final forms, where the humor had not yet found its limits, where the warmth had not yet begun the long process of cooling. That show exists now only in reruns and in memory. But it exists in both of those places in full. Every joke still lands the same way. Every character beat still hits. The episodes from those first 3 seasons are as good as they ever were, and the fact that the show continued for 20 more years and became a different thing does not diminish them. The early seasons are their own complete thing. They do not need the later seasons to justify them, and the later seasons do not undo them. Seth MacFarlane was 25 years old when the show premiered. He is in his early 50s now. The show has outlasted 2 major network cancellations, a writer's strike, a global pandemic, a media industry that has restructured itself completely around him, and the entire arc of his own career. It has produced over 400 episodes. It has generated hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. It has been studied by philosophers and sociologists and media critics. It has been blamed for the coarsening of public discourse and credited with breaking down social taboos. It has made people laugh and made people angry and made people feel, occasionally, something genuine and surprising about characters they thought they knew. And somewhere in all of that, hidden so well that most people who watched it never quite found it, was the thing it was really about. A man in a house in Rhode Island, his wife who deserved better, his children who were trying to figure out who they were, his dog who wanted to be more than he was allowed to be. The ordinary, extraordinary mess of a family navigating a world that was not quite what it had promised to be, with as much love as they could manage, which was sometimes quite a lot and sometimes not nearly enough. That is what it was hiding. That is what it was always hiding. And now that you know, you can never quite watch it the same way again. Which is, of course, exactly the point. Thank you for listening all the way through. Please subscribe if you have not already. Leave a comment. Tell me where you are in the world and what time it is and what you are going to dream about tonight. I will be here. There is always more to find. A final word on why any of this matters. You might reasonably ask why it matters that a cartoon about a stupid man and his talking dog was hiding something underneath the surface. Why it matters that the cutaway gags were doing something structurally interesting. Why it matters that Brian Griffin was a self-portrait. Why any of this deserves the kind of patient, careful attention that this video has tried to give it. The answer is this: because the things we give our attention to for 25 years are always doing something to us, whether or not we are paying conscious attention to what that thing is. The shows we watch in the background, the comedies we put on when we are too tired to watch something demanding, the entertainment we consume without thinking, none of it is neutral. It is always shaping something, always reinforcing something or questioning something or sneaking some frame into your understanding of the world. Family Guy shaped a generation of American viewers. It shaped how they thought about families, about masculinity, about faith, about intelligence, about who deserves to be mocked and who deserves to be taken seriously. It shaped the language of internet culture in ways that are still visible in the memes and the jokes and the reference patterns that circulate online decades after the episodes that spawned them first aired. If the show was hiding something real underneath all of that shaping influence, then the hidden thing matters. Because the hidden thing was always doing its work, whether or not the people being shaped by it could see it. The portrait of the trapped working-class man was being absorbed by people who recognized themselves in it. The portrait of the intellectual dog who could not escape his position was resonating with people who knew that feeling from the inside. The portrait of the family that stayed together in spite of everything was being consumed by families that were trying to do the same. That resonance was not accidental. It was not a byproduct of the comedy. It was the point. The comedy was the delivery system. The recognition was what the show was actually trying to produce. And the fact that it mostly did not admit this, that it kept its intentions hidden inside its irreverence, kept its feelings inside its jokes, kept its serious arguments inside its absurdity, was the final, most complete expression of what the show was always, at its core, about. Performing one thing while being another. Showing the world a face that was not quite the whole face. Hiding the real self inside a character that was easier for the world to handle. Being, in other words, human. Messy and dishonest and lovable and insufficient and trying imperfectly to connect. That is what Family Guy was hiding the entire time. That is also what most of us are hiding, most of the time. Which is, in the end, the only thing worth making a 25-year show about. Good night.